Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs will come to order. Welcome to our two witnesses. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your public service. Today's hearing is a hybrid format. I appreciate the witnesses being here in person. Members have the option, as you know. A home is so much more than four walls and a roof. It's the refuge you return to after a long, hard day at work. It's what keeps you safe at night. It's where you make memories with your children, watching them take their first steps, taking first day of school pictures. For middle-class family, a home is their single biggest source of wealth, more than bank savings or retirement accounts. For those who aspire to the middle class, home ownership is seen as often the way to get there. It's not just physical security, it's economic security. Families count on the value of their home as they think about sending their kids to college or about how they'll afford retirement. And how much your home is worth matters. For decades, from the black codes to Jim Crow, this country locked Black Americans out of one opportunity after another. The opportunity to vote, the opportunity to get an equal education, the opportunity to have the basic dignity of being able to pick your seat on a bus or a train. 1933, when America was a very segregated country by law in many places, the federal government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, essentially setting up what would become the 30-year mortgage so that more families could own their homes. Soon after, federal policy followed the lead of local communities, locking in discrimination and locking out Black families. With redlining maps, our government cut off mortgage access and with it access to affordable homeownership in neighborhoods where Black and brown families lived. For more than 30 years, from 1934 to 1968, the federal government endorsed the idea that homes and neighborhoods were worth less because of the race of the people who lived there. The Fair Housing Act was passed to change that and slowly began to. In 1968, we affirmed that no one should be denied housing or discriminated against based on the color of their skin or where they were born. In case it wasn't clear, the courts and then Congress made it clear that using race to determine a home's value would finally be illegal discrimination. But just because it's illegal doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Look at home values across neighborhoods today. It's obvious that redlining of the past has not been undone. I know that in my own neighborhood. Talk to Black families who've had their home appraised, listen to the stories they tell you. Discrimination's still happening. Look what happened to the Parkers, an African-American family in Loveland, Ohio, a Cincinnati suburb. Just last year, after their appraisal came in far lower than they or their realtor expected, the Parkers took down their family photos, took them off the wall, had a white friend meet a new appraiser. Their home was suddenly worth $92,000 more, 20% more than the appraisal when it looked like a Black family lived there. That's about as clear-cut as an example of how this discrimination works as you could find, and it was last year. When a Black family owns the home, it's worth one price. When a white family owns the home, it's very likely worth a different price, in this case, 20% higher price. Ms. Parker said in an interview she had to tell her 6-year-old daughter, you can picture this little Black girl walking around with her parents as her mom and dad took down family pictures, took them off the wall. She told her 6-year-old daughter, sometimes because of the color of our skin, we get treated differently. That's something no parent should have to say, no child should have to hear. Happens all the time. When Andre Perry of Brookings looked at home values, he found that homes in majority Black neighborhoods were worth 23% less than homes in neighborhoods with few Black residents, even when they had the same access to the same quality school, same access to business, same rates of crime. 23%. That means 23% less for college tuition, 23% less for retirement, 23% less to put a down payment on the next home, 23% less to pass on to your children and your grandchildren. Appraisals determine the value of your home based on how much your neighbor's home sold for. So the devaluation of a home today means that homes down the street will sell for less. That in turn means the next home that gets appraised will come in lower, and on it goes for years and years, for decades and decades, for generations. And the cycle continues unless we end it. That's the reason for this hearing and the FUDGE report, the HUD report. Last year, the administration took the first step and announced an initiative headed by Secretary Fudge to address bias in home appraisals. She formed an interagency task force led by Melody Taylor, who's joined us today, that released an action plan to tackle this problem. The task force plan focuses on actions that federal agencies can take today: strengthen oversight of fair lending laws, identify and address systemic issues in the appraisal process, grow and diversify the appraiser workforce, give consumers tools to report bias that they see or that they've been aimed at them. Today, we'll hear from Ms. Taylor and from Jim Park, the head of the federal organization that oversees the appraisal regulatory process, about what federal agencies will do to put this plan into action. We'll also hear what we can do to help them do their work. This isn't theoretical. This is an issue that has real consequences for the millions of families that we serve in Montana and Pennsylvania and Ohio. I look forward to hearing what we can do to make sure millions of Americans like Ms. Parker never have to settle for less. Ranking Member Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Almost a year ago, we held a hearing on discrimination in housing, and I'll say again today what I said then: racial discrimination is a real and sad part of our nation's history. It's a fact. Sadly, it's also a fact that government policies have contributed to this discrimination. In my view, history shows us that when it comes to housing in America, including housing discrimination, government has often been the problem, not the solution. First, we should ask ourselves why the government is micromanaging the appraisal process. As long as taxpayers are not on the hook for the risk-taking and subject to existing consumer protection and anti-discrimination laws, each private sector market participant should be free to develop its own approach to underwriting its loans. And that flexibility should permit significant discretion to experiment with new technologies like automated valuation models or other alternatives to full appraisals of loan collateral. For example, when there are numerous bids for a home, the best appraisal is probably the market itself. But unfortunately, that's not the system we have today. Instead, taxpayers stand behind more than 2/3 of our mortgage loans, and federal appraisal regulation extends even to much of the small remaining portion that's not backed by the government. Government intervention begets more government intervention. And here we are today with my colleagues advocating a, quote, action plan that will layer yet more regulation on top of an already Byzantine and antiquated set of appraisal regulations. Thankfully, there are laws against discrimination for real estate transactions, including appraisals. As a result, most institutions have long since abandoned explicit racial discrimination. Even the President's nominee for HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research has publicly acknowledged that. Has the appraisal industry somehow avoided this law? Well, this administration seems to believe that despite the progress we've made to eliminate discrimination in housing, the appraisal industry remains systemically racist. Yesterday, the administration's Task Force on Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, or PAVE, released a report alleging systemic racial bias in home appraisals. Now, this comes as a bit of a surprise. The report recommends an action plan to address this alleged systemic racism before the government has sufficiently established that a systemic problem exists in the first place. In fact, the report admits that, quote, the exact number of instances of valuation bias is difficult to assess, end quote. And one of the report's recommended actions is to establish metrics to identify appraisal bias. Well, that certainly calls into question whether the authors have enough data to know whether their conclusion is correct. Now, of course, we should not ignore incidents of appraisals that appear to be attributable to race, and this happens. There have been news reports of homes being appraised for more when black owners had white people stand in for them, as the chairman has relayed an anecdote to that effect. An FHFA reviewed millions of appraisals and found some instances where the appraiser included direct references to race or another protected class. These things are not right. But as bad as these anecdotes are, do they prove that there are systemic problems? And should the government upend the appraisal regime and in the process impose significantly higher costs on people buying homes without confirmation that there is a systemic problem here? So it isn't at all clear that we have a systemic problem of appraisers undervaluing homes based on a borrower's race. The PAVE task force relied primarily upon 2 studies that have questionable analyses that fail to control for other factors other than race that once considered may explain disparities. Other studies disclose their limitations and note that their results are not conclusive evidence of racial bias. Even Fannie Mae's study, the one relied upon by the task force, found, and I quote, "The differences observed in undervaluation between white and black borrowers were similar in rate and not meaningfully different," end quote. That's from Fannie Mae. And another recent academic study, which the PAVE report fails to cite, found racial appraisal bias in mortgage refinance transactions to be either uncommon or to have relatively minor effect on valuations. Yet we are still holding a hearing today to address what we are told is a systemic problem of racial bias in home appraisals. So I'm concerned that the PAVE report devotes only half a page to a discussion of the risks of overvaluing homes. Instead, the report recommends studying the use of alternatives to the sale comparison approach of appraisal and the use of range of value estimates instead of a single value estimate for appraisals. But rather than increasing the accuracy of appraisals, these suggestions increase the risk of overvaluation. And that risk is exacerbated for rural properties, which already can be challenging to appraise. I don't think we should be doing anything to make appraisals of rural housing more difficult, nor should we adopt recommendations that, in general, could undermine confidence in appraisals and ultimately reduce the availability of credit for all borrowers. The overvaluation of homes harms taxpayers on the hook for underwater mortgages, and it also harms borrowers, in many cases minority borrowers, who've been sold overvalued homes. I hope we reject any changes that end up increasing the risk of overvaluation. As I've said before, one of the lessons we should learn and apply is that when it comes to housing in America, government has often been the problem, not the solution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. I introduce today's witnesses. Melody Taylor is the Executive Director of the Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, PAVE, Interagency Task Force, which Senator Toomey and I mentioned. She serves as the Regional Director for the Mid-Atlantic Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at HUD. Ms. Taylor's work includes 20 years of experience in fair housing. Ms. Taylor, welcome to the committee. Mr. Jim Park is the Executive Director of the Appraisal Subcommittee, a member of the PAVE Interagency Task Force. He has over 23 years of appraisal and mortgage banking experience, including serving as the Director of Research and Technical Issues at the Appraisal Foundation. He's also a certified general appraiser in Virginia. Mr. Park, welcome to the committee. Ms. Taylor, please begin.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. And good morning. Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and other members, I'm extremely honored to have been invited to address the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. As stated, appointed by Secretary Marcia Fudge in July 2021, I serve as the Executive Director of the Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity Task Force and as the Regional Director for the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. My contributions and commitment to fair housing and civil rights spans over 20 years as a career civil servant with HUD and with the Department of Justice. I've also had the privilege of working with local government and leading fair housing groups here in the nation's capital, focusing on insurance and lending discrimination issues. Each day in America, the value of our neighbors' homes determines whether they can use cash for refinancing their homes, to send their children to college, start a business, access credit on reasonable terms, and ultimately, whether their children and their offspring will benefit from the transfer of multi-generational wealth that can occur through home ownership. This is the American dream. Sadly, accounts of appraisal bias have captured national headlines in recent months. Yesterday, during the launch of the action plan, we heard from the Austins, a Black couple in Marin City, California. In early 2020, they decided to refinance and take advantage of low interest rates to finish the remodel on their home. An appraiser was needed to validate this transaction, but came back woefully under market. The value was at $995,000. Weeks later, after they whitewashed their home, they asked a friend to come in and pose as the homeowner. And this was within weeks. The appraisal came back $1.48 million, more than 50% higher. Research has shown that their experience are not one-offs. Rather, they are part of a recurring pattern of racial bias. Further validated by Freddie Mac's study published in 2021, which found that appraisals for home purchases in majority Black and majority Latino neighborhoods were roughly twice as likely to result in a value below the actual contract price compared to appraisals in predominantly white neighborhoods. Similarly, Fannie Mae examined refinance transactions and found that white-owned homes are more likely than black-owned homes to be appraised at values that exceed algorithmic predictions. As noted in the PAVE action plan, the compounding effects of undervaluations over time has the effect of lowering wealth among homeowners, thereby contributing to the expansive wealth gap. For this reason and more, on June 1st, President Biden announced the creation of the Interagency Task Force on Property Appraisal Valuation Equity, co-chaired by HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge and White House Domestic Policy Advisor Ambassador Susan Rice. The task force was directed to accomplish two things: evaluate the cause, extent, and consequences of racial and ethnic appraisal bias, and establish a set of actions to root out bias in the valuation of residential property. Immediately, the task force convened 13 cabinet-level and independent agencies and White House offices as members, committed to creating meaningful, comprehensive administrative and policy actions. It is important to know we did not take this journey alone. Utilizing a holistic approach, we engaged and sought input from realtors, appraisers, philanthropy, academics, civil rights leaders, and people impacted by bias to identify solutions to bring about change with a sense of immediacy. The product is a blueprint describing the history and impact of persistent misvaluations, early progress wins already made toward transforming the industry, and 21 concrete actions and commitments to advance equity in the home buying process. Member agencies will take the following actions: make the appraisal industry more accountable, empower consumers, prevent algorithmic bias in home valuations, cultivate an appraiser profession that is well-trained and looks like the communities it serves, leverage federal data and expertise to inform policy, practice, and research on appraisal bias. In conclusion, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and other members, I thank you for the opportunity to share this with you and the public. Federal and independent agencies taking the whole of government approach to address a longstanding wealth gap issue in a way that will create legacies for future generations. We look forward to the partnership and opportunities to further amplify the success of this task force. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor. Mr. Park, welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, members of the committee. I'm honored to address the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs on the important work of the Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity Task Force, which was set up by President Biden with Secretary Fudge and Ambassador Rice, leading a first-of-its-kind interagency initiative to address inequity in home appraisals. I've had the distinct honor as the Executive Director of the Appraisal Subcommittee of participating on the PAVE Task Force. For millions of Americans, building intergenerational wealth has meant one thing: homeownership. Appraisals and appraisers play a vital role in the multi-trillion-dollar financial services market by providing key risk management tools that protect financial institutions and consumers. Numerous public accounts of appraisal bias, coupled with a lack of appraiser diversity in recent studies, raise serious concerns about appraisals and lending practices and appraisal governance, shining a light on an industry that needs reform to promote equity. As background, our current appraisal regulatory system was established in 1989. Title 11 of the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act, or FIREA, established this unique appraisal regulatory system consisting of the state appraiser regulatory programs, the Appraisal Foundation, a private nonprofit, and the Appraisal Subcommittee, or ASC, as the federal oversight body. In short, the foundation issues the appraisal standards and appraiser qualifications. The states are required by law to implement those requirements, and the ASC enforces that implementation by the states. The ASC also houses the National Registry of Appraisers and appraisal management companies. In addition to the PAVE Task Force initiative, in January 2022, the ASC released its independent study that focused on the foundation's appraisal standards and appraiser qualification criteria. The goal of this study was to ensure these standards and qualifications do not facilitate or systematize racial or ethnic bias. The PAVE Action Plan and the independent report commissioned by the ASC identified serious shortcomings and opportunities for reform. Some of the pressing challenges with our current system I'd like to highlight today include inadequate accountability in our current governance structure, a shortage of appraisers, and finally, a lack of diversity in the appraisal profession. On governance, the PAVE report notes that the existing governance structure needs to be fundamentally reassessed to meaningfully advance equity in the industry. Per Title 11 of FIREA, the ASC is required to monitor and review the foundation. However, the agency has neither the enforcement authority nor an effective mechanism for holding the foundation accountable. The appraisal profession also faces other challenges. Since 2009, the number of credentials on the ASC's National Registry has declined by nearly 25%. Furthermore, the real property appraiser occupation is among the least diverse in the country. An extensive and typically unpaid trainee model, along with burdensome education and experience requirements, present barriers to entry that disproportionately impact people of color and rural residents. Trainees are often unable to find a supervisor, as qualified appraisers are often unwilling to take on the responsibility and liability of training them, or may have reservations about training their own future competition, resulting in a shortage of appraisers, particularly in rural markets. This has driven up service times and appraisal fees to unacceptable levels, causing loans to be delayed or even lost. Appraiser qualification requirements should absolutely have the appropriate rigor, but not pose unreasonable barriers to enter the profession. These long-standing, unaddressed issues have serious implications for everyday Americans. An improved governance structure would advance equity by ensuring greater fairness and transparency in the appraisal standards and appraiser qualification setting process. It would also advance a more stable and reliable appraisal industry to serve financial services and consumers alike. The ASC stands ready to be part of the solutions to the challenges to bring about meaningful long-term change that will only come from partnerships with other stakeholders, including lenders, the GSEs, regulators, and legislators. Thank you, Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Toomey and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today and am happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Park. Ms. Taylor, one biased appraisal doesn't just hurt the individual or the family selling their home. It can have, as you point out, a pervasive effect on an entire neighborhood. Walk through, if you would, how one appraisal can have an impact, a significant impact on a whole community. Walk through that process, please.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. In the PAVE report, we speak to the compounding effect of undervaluation in a community. With regards to a homeowner, for example, if one were to refinance their home, for example, the undervaluation of a refinance transaction could have the potential to not just impact that individual, but the entire community, thus creating disinvestment in the community, economic instability. It has the similar effect of the redlining history that we know that this country has created. And so therefore, when one doesn't have the opportunity to have their property appraised accurately and fairly, there's a loss of wealth to that home and the compounding interest to other homes in the community.
And the future for that family.
Yes, sir.
So why is that? Fair housing, first Secretary of HUD was, for the Secretary of HUD after the Fair Housing Bill in 1968 was the father of our colleague, Mitt Romney. He went in with good intentions. The president, maybe not so much, but nonetheless, we passed that in 1968. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act would ban discrimination, access to credit. In 1974, these laws, as Senator Toomey said, these laws are explicit. They prohibit discrimination and appraisals. Using a discriminatory appraisal to make or refuse a mortgage loan is illegal. So why haven't these laws been enough to prevent this discrimination from happening still today?
Thank you, sir. Discrimination is not a science. And although the laws are on the books, the home ownership gap is even more expansive today, and it's wider today.
In 68, in 1968.
Than 1968. Yes, Chairman Brown. I believe strongly, and again, the PAVE report points to the fact that individuals don't know that they've been discriminated against. There's a lack of awareness. There's a lack of access to information relating to discrimination. Discrimination happens when a transaction happens. You described in your statement, imagine someone who has saved up. They're in the process. They had to remove things from the home. It's a transactional experience, and it requires that individuals be able to understand where in the process that discrimination occurs. And so, again, as a part of the PAVE action plan, we highlight and note that we need to increase awareness through a public awareness campaign in our housing counseling programs to increase awareness there and train housing counselors to provide education to consumers on appraisal bias.
Thank you. And think about the persistence of this. 1933 HOLC passed. 1934 is when the appraisal, the federal government essentially followed local lead and established these A, B, C, D neighborhoods, if you will, locking in redlining. It's a little more softly to immigrants, but especially to African Americans. 30 plus years, 1934 to 1968, redlining was legal. Then, and in that period, 98% of FHA loans, 98% of FHA loans, I spoke on this on the floor yesterday, went to white homeowners. Then you think what you just outlined from 1968 today, how persistent and pervasive this is. So thank you for clarifying that. My other question, Mr. Parker, I have a question for you. PAVE Task Force committed to work with Congress to allow more groups beyond the appraisal industry to comment and influence rulemaking procedures. Could you expand on this part of the action plan, Mr. Park? Discuss whether this would improve existing regulations and oversight of the appraisal industry?
Thank you, Chairman Brown. Yes, the appraisal industry right now is lacking appropriate governance. We need more accountability and transparency in the standards and qualifications setters. They should be subject to an APA rulemaking process so that all facets of society, whether it be minorities, rural property owners, all have an opportunity to comment and have their opinions voiced and their concerns voiced to the standards and qualifications setters, so we have a fair and equitable system for everyone.
Thank you. Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by saying, Mr. Park, I'm sympathetic to the idea that appraiser qualification requirements can create unnecessary barriers to entry and have the effect of protecting the existing guild, and I'm open to a conversation about how we make it more accessible to more people. I am concerned that while there's no question there are a number of terrible anecdotes of racial bias in appraisals, it's not clear to me that there's enough actual substantive data to come to the conclusion that we have systemic racism in the appraisal process. The PAVE Task Force acknowledges in its report that, quote, valuation bias is difficult to assess, end quote. The report also recommends establishing metrics to identify bias. It does seem strange to suggest widespread or systemic disparities when the government hasn't yet measured or studied the scope of the problem, or maybe even decide what metrics would indicate that there's a systemic problem. The report does, however, reference and base its recommendations primarily on two preliminary studies by Fannie and Freddie, which, by the way, in some important respects come to contradictory conclusions. So I want to ask a little bit about the research upon which the PAVE report seems to heavily rely. Ms. Taylor, first of all, I'm sure you'd acknowledge GSEs are primarily in the business of buying mortgages and selling mortgage-backed securities and not primarily academics, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did the task force look at independent academic research that reached different conclusions than the two GSE studies?
Thank you for that question, and yes, we did. There were a number of studies that we evaluated, and I'd just like to reiterate the FHFA study that evaluated millions of appraisals and the freeform text data that was used there. And we saw in that particular study where appraisers documented the context of a neighborhood.
Yeah, I saw that. These are anecdotes, though, and it looks like most of the conclusions and most of the references in the report refer back to these two studies. Let me ask you this. The data that the GSEs relied on for their studies, is that publicly available data? I don't think it is.
It is not.
It is not. Who could release that data? It could be anonymized. I'm not suggesting that it have identifying information, but who has the authority to release that?
Right now, that's one of the objectives of the PAVE action plan. Data based on even the industry, came back to us to recommend that we make data publicly available.
So I think FHFA has the authority to do that. It could release this data, and then you could do what peer review of academic research normally does, is allow lots of people to evaluate the same data so that they can come to the right conclusions. And yet, that's not possible when the data is not available. Let me also ask you about this. On the issue of undervaluations, Fannie's study of mortgage refinances found, and I quote, "The differences observed in undervaluation between white and black borrowers were similar in rate and not meaningfully different." So Fannie concludes that undervaluations don't have any evidence of systemic differences, much less systemic bias. Now, that's for undervaluations. In Fannie's research, they found overvaluations of white-owned homes were more likely to occur in majority black neighborhoods than overvaluation of black-owned homes. And you mentioned that in the report, this observation. But the report does not include, I don't think, another observation that the Fannie research comes to, which is, and I quote, "The difference in frequency of overvaluations along race may well be due to factors other than racial bias in appraisals, such as gentrification." And there's a clear logic for why gentrification could create a dynamic where you would have this. So I guess the question is, how do you come to a conclusion that there's systemic bias in appraisals when the two primary sources that you use, first of all, 2 seems like a pretty low number of studies, and they contradict each other with respect to undervaluations?
Thank you for that, Ranking Member Toomey. Just a couple of things I would like to just share. So there have been a number of studies released over the last several years on this topic. And our assessment of all available literature, including from academics, government entities, nonprofits, point to consistent evidence of inequity in home appraisals, with Black and Latino homeowners more likely to experience misvaluation even after accounting for other factors. What we know is that the subjectivity and the discretion of the appraisal process and the vast discretion given to appraisers is providing their opinion of value, and it does create a space for other forms of bias.
Well, you've restated your conclusion. My point is that the data that you've presented does not meaningfully support that conclusion, in my view. There's no doubt there are terrible anecdotes of racial bias in appraisals, but if we're going to upend an industry and have the consequence of raising the cost of home ownership for Americans, let's not kid ourselves. These reforms would increase the cost of the appraisal process, and that means homeowners, home buyers, would have to pay that. If we're going to do that, I think it should be based on reliable data. The reports, there were just 2. The data is proprietary, so it can't be evaluated by independent academics. In important respects, they contradict each other. And appraisals are an important component of the whole home buying exercise. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Toomey. Senator Menendez from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. and thank you for holding this hearing. Look, I know that there are some who will never see a bias in anything and just presume that our systems work, colorblind, efficiently, effectively, and without consequence to certain communities. And I wish that was the case. But that is simply not the case. Freddie Mac published a study last year on the topic of appraisal bias. And one of the key findings of that study was that appraisal gaps in minority census tracts is not being driven by a limited number of bad actors, but rather that, quote, a large portion of appraisers are generating statistically significant gaps. Ms. Taylor, can you give a brief overview on the standards for housing appraisers, particularly whether they are required to go under any kind of bias training?
Thank you for that question, Senator. Currently, there is not a requirement for appraisers to attend fair housing or bias training. Although there are several states that do require it, it is not a requirement for certification.
Well, that appraisal workforce is a shrinking field with more than 12% decline in appraiser credentials since 2011. At the same time, that workforce is becoming less and less representative of the population. A survey from the Appraisal Foundation found that 68% of appraisers are male, 92% are non-Hispanic whites, and 2 in 3 are 55 years or older. So I understand maybe why some of the appraisals are skewed, not because I said it, but because Freddie Mac said it. I don't think Freddie Mac is a flaming liberal organization. When a homeowner receives a discriminatory appeal, they suffer a tangible financial injury. Consumers shouldn't have to bear this cost, and in many circumstances, they're unable to bear it. Brookings estimates that the appraisal gap can cost homeowners in majority black neighborhoods an average of $48,000. What legal recourse do victims of discriminatory appraisals have?
Thank you for that question, Senator. Under the Fair Housing Act, individuals who have been discriminated are able to file a complaint through Housing and Urban Development, Office of Fair Housing Equal Opportunity, either the Department of Justice, if there's believed to be a pattern or practice in that area, and under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, if one would believe that they've been violated under that particular purview.
So they can file a complaint, but by the time how long does a complaint normally take to get processed? Do we have any idea?
Well, by statute, we have 100 days under the Fair Housing Act to investigate a complaint of discrimination.
Yeah. So 100 days probably puts them outside of the time in which they're trying to buy that home, because I don't know of too many, having done real estate transactions when I was a lawyer, I don't know of too many transactions that will allow you to wait 100 days for a closing. And so it basically puts the individual in the challenge. And so he or she loses out on one home because of an unfair appraisal. Okay, so they file a complaint. Now they go to buy another home, and maybe they suffer the same set of circumstances. So it's a never-ending challenge for that person. And I have also seen that as if appraisal bias that routinely costs Black and Latino homeowners tens of thousands of dollars wasn't bad enough, these communities are also getting hit with inflated tax bills. Research indicates that Black-owned homes are consistently assessed at higher values relative to their share price than white homes. And that, combined with the prior administration's changes to the state and local property tax deduction, minority families are being hit with higher tax bills on undervalued homes. Is this something that your department has observed? And if so, what can be done at the federal level to deal with it?
Thank you for that question. We, in the PAVE action plan, speak to tax assessments, but we've also acknowledged and determined that it is a complex set of circumstances that differed from the scope in which we were evaluating home buying discrimination in the appraisal process and refinance processes. tax assessments are often a very local initiative and controlled by local, political processes, and therefore was something that we were unable to, in the narrow scope of time of this particular report, were able to address and identify. But we do have that, purpose for future.
Well, I hope you will pursue that. The final question, if I hear, Mr. Chairman, in all of this, would housing counseling help someone navigate these challenges?
Thank you for that, and absolutely, sir. You'll see in the PAVE action plan that we've identified that appraisal bias training will be a part of HUD's housing counseling operations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator. Senator Tester of Montana is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member for having this hearing, and I want to thank both Ms. Taylor and Mr. Park for the testimony that you've given today. I very much appreciate it. I come from Montana. In my state, we've had challenges around appraisal delays, a problem in a lot of rural areas in our country. And that's the fact that Mr. Park brought up, that there's too few appraisers. And then you combine that with how far they have to travel, it becomes a problem. And as chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, I also heard about the challenge that our nation's veterans run into in Montana and all across the country when they try to buy a home using a VA loan. And one step that I have advocated to help make sure these challenges are getting addressed is adding representatives from the VA and USDA's Rural Housing Service to the Appraisal Committee. In addition to FHA and VA and USDA have direct knowledge of the appraisal process and how it can impact the home buying process. So, Mr. Park, how could the ASC and your work there be improved by the knowledge and perspective of VA and USDA representatives, or is that something that wouldn't be an improvement?
Thank you for that question, Senator Tester. In my opinion, adding the Veterans Administration and USDA Rural Housing Development to the Appraisal Subcommittee is a great idea. My father was a veteran of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. After retiring from the Air Force, he set up an appraisal company. He did VA appraisals. I cut my teeth doing VA appraisals. The VA has a very unique relationship with their appraisers. The VA is the client of the appraiser, and that's unusual for the federal government. So they really understand what's going on in the appraisal market, in the appraisal profession. Adding USDA Rural Housing Development would give the subcommittee more perspective on the needs and concerns of rural communities. And we need more of that. We hear lots of complaints about shortages of appraisers in these rural communities.
Thank you for that. This is for both of you, and it deals with the shortage of appraiser issue and the barriers it creates for prospective home buyers as it applies to rural America, and may apply to urban America too. Mm-hmm. But what more can we do to address those shortages issues? What should we be doing? I'll leave it at that. I'm not going to give you anywhere to go. You guys tell me where you want to go. And it's for both of you. So go ahead, Mr. Park, and then Ms. Taylor.
Thank you for that question. Well, first, I think we need to take a real hard look at the qualification requirements to become an appraiser. Right now, one of the biggest barriers to entry to becoming an appraiser is the experience requirement.
Yep.
In order to gain the necessary experience, you have to find a supervisor. And a lot of appraisers, as I mentioned in my testimony, do not want to be a supervisor unless you have a family member, I'm a perfect example, or a friend or somebody who is willing to take on that liability to train somebody. It can be almost impossible. Both in my job now, in previous jobs, I frequently have received calls from trainees who have gone through the education and gone through much of the process, and they can't find a supervisor for years. It's even more difficult in rural markets because of the distances and the limited number of appraisers in these markets.
Okay, Ms. Taylor.
Thank you for that question. I would just add to my colleague's statement or testimony that increasing the training opportunities for appraisers. We believe that a well-trained organization should look like the communities that they serve, and so we want to make sure that appraisers are well-trained. The action plan also speaks to very specifically reaching out to the Appraisal Foundation, their qualifications board, and requesting consideration to reduce or eliminate the Appraisal Qualifications Board experience requirements, but also to develop a comprehensive exam as an alternative path to credentialing, which will allow for a bit more expediency in that process and perhaps would increase the opportunity for appraisers to be onboarded in a more, efficient way.
I appreciate that. Look, not only the liability question that you brought up, Mr. Park, but also the fact that we're asking people to train people who are going to be in competition with them doesn't make a lot of sense, quite honestly. And so the delay issue on appraisals is a big issue, and I think we need to really work on this to try to get this solved. I just want to address Senator Toomey just for a second, and that at the end of his comments he said, in housing, government is never the solution. I beg to differ. 30-year fixed-rate mortgages have been pretty successful to get people in. But I also want to agree with something Mr. Toomey, or Senator Toomey said, and that is that I don't know why we don't have more transparency on the information. I think it would help. I'm talking about the information that determines whether or not there is systemic racism or not. I think having access to that information would very much help us to be able to make some determinations. I think it's always helpful. With that, I want to thank you guys.
50% isn't bad, right? 50% isn't bad. He liked one thing you said and didn't like the other.
I'll take that every time.
Thank you. Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized from her office.
Thank you, Chair Brown, and thanks to the committee and our testifiers. And I too would like to come down on the side of data transparency, so I think that is good. I also just want to come back to Ms. Taylor briefly, and just to clarify, I mean, do you believe that there is sufficient evidence of systemic disparities in the research that you've seen to mean that it's important that we look into this and figure out what to do about it?
Thank you for that question, Senator. We do believe that there's sufficient evidence, although we also recognize and acknowledge repeatedly that we've heard that data needs to be available and accessible, and we actually agree. In the PAVE Action Plan, we note that we want to get data to researchers, we want to get data to the industry and others, akin to the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, which has been extremely impactful in helping industry and enforcement agencies understand where discrimination is occurring and the frequency of it. So we acknowledge that is something that should happen, and the PAVE Task Force, beyond this report, will be working on creating that opportunity as well. Thank you.
Thank you. That's good. I strongly support that, and I look forward to doing everything I can to contribute to getting that done. So I think, Chair Brown was getting at this in his opening questions. That the question we're all grappling with is, what do we do to eliminate the bias that it seems that we see here? The Fair Housing Act of 1968 already bans discrimination on the basis of race, and obviously, yet we still haven't solved this problem. I mean, we can see it so dramatically in the disparities and the wealth gap and home ownership gap that I see in my own home state of Minnesota, in Minneapolis. So dramatic disparities between between Black families and white families. So a recent New York Times article suggested that remote or desktop or appraisals of homes could be a way to reduce discrimination. Some of my colleagues have highlighted other ideas for how to reduce this bias, increasing diversity in the appraiser workforce, for example, training. I'd like to just ask Ms. Taylor and Mr. Park, could you just comment on some of these solutions, and if there are other things that you think that we need to look at to address this bias?
Go for it. Thank you for that question, Senator Smith. Part of the issue that we have to grapple with here is likely implicit or unconscious bias on the part of appraisers. The fact that the vast majority, almost all appraisers, frankly, are white means that there may be some unconscious bias that creeps into appraisal reports. There's a lot of discretion in how appraisers make their adjustments, how they choose comparable sales, and how they ultimately reconcile to the final value conclusion. So we need to find ways to remove as much of that discretion as possible. We also need training. Appraisers, the last few years, have been a real education for myself as an appraiser. It's been a real gut check. Appraisers are not aware, for the most part, about their requirements relative to the Fair Housing Act. Appraisers aren't required to take courses on the Fair Housing Act or fair lending. So it's important that appraisers be educated and gain a further understanding of these issues in minority communities.
Thank you. Ms. Taylor?
The only thing I could add to my colleague's statement is that you mentioned that the Fair Housing Act exists and that individuals are still being discriminated against. And just having been a practitioner over the years, and the notion that we're talking about evidence and whether discrimination exists or not, I've seen, although the numbers may suggest that discrimination is not on the rise, what we see with our partners with the National Fair Housing Alliance and in our Fair Housing Initiatives program is that they receive over 28,000 calls a year or more where people believe that they've been discriminated against. And I would just add that awareness is critical to helping individuals know or understand, helping them understand their rights, and to ensure that the appraisal industry understands its obligations under the Fair Housing Act and Equal Credit Opportunity Act, I believe will bring about some transformative change.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Smith. Senator Van Hollen from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank both of you, and thank you for the report that you did. I'm just going to pick up really quickly on Senator Smith's question and your response about appraisal, education, and complaints by individuals who feel that their house has not been fairly appraised, because the Maryland Commission of Real Estate Appraisers said it receives about 5 complaints per month, which is not a huge number. And one of the issues that came up there is that consumers and homeowners who may feel that they've been discriminated against don't know the process for complaints. Is there, and if there was a more obvious and open process, that would also have an accountability feature in the system. Can you talk about how we can better improve consumers' understanding of what their rights to appeal an appraisal might be, or complain if they think they've been a victim of discrimination? Either of you. Ms. Taylor?
So I'll start first. Part of the PAVE action plan and something that we produced as recent as yesterday, we launched a new website. And that website provides for places where an individual within whatever state that they live in, they're able to understand or gain access to information regarding how to potentially appeal or in that state. But under the Discrimination or Fair Housing Act and Equal Credit Opportunity Act, we've created links to that website to allow for greater access to information as well. And I firmly believe, and we don't do a deep dive in the report on this, is that it's a grassroots effort. It's something that we, as an agency, as a task force and at the 13 members that aligned and harmonized on the work that's needed in this area. We have a great opportunity to work with organizations, nonprofits, academics, philanthropy, in fact, to be about the business of educating the public and getting them information. It is definitely a process that, as we discovered during this task force, you know, getting to information and who to go to and how to file with the various degrees and levels of complexity is difficult, and it's something that we've addressed, and we plan to create an opportunity to better serve the consumer.
No, thank you. I think to the extent that we can, you know, create more of a sort of transparent process, an informed process on that, that would be helpful. So, Ms. Taylor, I do want to follow up a little bit on Senator Tester's questions with respect to the workforce and diversifying the workforce. And I understand he asked about the suggestion that you may want to consider changing the supervisory requirements because, as we know, sometimes having a supervisor in a structured quality program can be a good thing if you can find one, but they can also be barriers to entry. And I gather your conclusion is in the area of appraisal, supervisors have been primarily a barrier to entry and an obstacle to greater diversification of the workforce. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And are there other measures we can take to open up the doors of opportunity more to the appraisal profession? Can we work with community colleges, HBCUs, four-year institutions, whatever it may be? Are there ways that we can increase the pathways to this kind of position so that we can increase the diversification of the workforce?
Absolutely. And in each one of your responses, those were things that we explored as recommendations and commitments in the action plan. But I defer to my colleague here because he's done a little bit of work here as well.
Thank you. Mr. Park, thank you.
Thank you for that question, Senator. The Appraisal Subcommittee right now, recognizing the shortage of appraisers and the lack of new appraisers coming into the system, has a federal grant program, and we're currently working with 2 states that have shortages of appraisers, South Dakota and Mississippi. In South Dakota, a grant has been provided for them to work with South Dakota State University to bring in more appraisers, to provide that training, to provide that supervisor, to provide the education so that when the appraiser comes out of the university, they're ready to go to work. This is also an opportunity to provide more, to provide these opportunities to Native Americans as well. In Mississippi, they're focusing on diversity, and they're currently, right now, setting up a system where they will provide this training to aspiring appraisers. And it's my understanding that about 50% of the applicants at this point are African American. One reason this is a good program is just because you're a certified appraiser doesn't mean you're qualified to supervise somebody, to train somebody. And if you're somebody who has implicit bias or doesn't understand the nuances of these issues, you're going to transfer that lack of knowledge to the people that you train. So we need a better system for bringing people into the profession, definitely.
Thank you. Look forward to working with you on that.
Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So appraisals are powerfully important. For example, they determine how much a lender will offer in financing a mortgage, and that in turn affects the price that a seller can get. If homes are accurately appraised, then the process works like it should. But Black and Hispanic homeowners have consistently faced discrimination in the appraisal process. According to a recent study, homes in majority Black neighborhoods are valued 23% lower than homes with similar characteristics in white majority neighborhoods, resulting in more than $150 billion in lost wealth for Black families. Because home ownership is the #1 way that middle-class families build wealth, the disparities in home valuation help perpetuate the racial wealth gap. Now, research shows that the persistent undervaluation of Black and Hispanic-owned homes is due in part to unconscious bias among appraisers. So it's not surprising that automated valuation models, AVMs, computer programs that use data to estimate home values, have been held up as an alternative. The argument goes that by taking the human element out of the appraisal process, we can eliminate bias and discrimination, which sounds terrific. But the reality of these algorithms is a whole lot more complicated. Ms. Taylor, you lead the Biden administration's interagency task force to root out racial discrimination in the appraisal process. Have AVMs produced the unbiased, error-free valuations that home lenders and homeowners were counting on?
Thank you for that question, Senator Warren. We looked at the Urban Institute's study, which found that AVMs in majority Black neighborhoods produce larger errors relative to the underlying sales price than AVMs in majority white neighborhoods, potentially contributing to the wide housing wealth gap between Black and white homeowners. Additionally, we believe that, while AVMs have the potential, if properly used, to reduce human bias and improve consistency in decision-making, however, just like human biased appraisals, they're not immune from the risk of discrimination. A phrase that oftentimes many people use data, bad data in equals bad outcomes. And we believe that we have to ensure that AVMs are responsible or the models are responsibly created.
So I want to underscore the point you're making because I think it's a very good point. The key issue is that AVMs are only as good as the data they use and the algorithms that interpret those data. And too often, these algorithms are just a black box with little visibility into the data and the modeling that are going on inside. And if the underlying data itself reflect past racial discrimination, AVMs may end up compounding disparities in valuation rather than reducing them. So let me just ask you a couple of pieces about this so we can disaggregate this a little bit. Ms. Taylor, majority Black neighborhoods tend to have a higher share of distressed home sales than majority white neighborhoods. Is that fact likely to contribute to AVMs systematically undervaluing Black-owned homes?
Yes, ma'am.
Majority Black neighborhoods also have lower household incomes on average. So, Ms. Taylor, is that likely to contribute to AVMs undervaluing Black-owned homes?
Yes, ma'am.
And what about if neighborhoods are gentrifying? Is that likely to contribute to the undervaluing of Black-owned homes?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. We pulled apart some of the pieces. The way I see this is that closing the racial wealth gap means that we need to confront decades of racist federal housing policies like redlining that helped create it in the first place. And part of this means ensuring that the legacies of racial discrimination aren't coded into the algorithms that have direct and real impact on families' wealth. Without proper guardrails and oversight, AVMs may reinforce racial disparities in the appraisal process and actually worsen the racial wealth gap. That's why I was very glad to see the CFPB take a step toward issuing rules on combating algorithmic bias in AVMs. Regulators should follow their lead and take the necessary steps to make sure that AVMs aren't putting home ownership and wealth building even further out of reach for families of color. Thank you very much for your work. Thank you for being here today. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada is with us from her office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the ranking member for having this hearing. Let me follow up on Senator Warren's comments and questioning. And let me pose this first to Ms. Taylor and then to Mr. Park. With respect to AVMs, are there limits to the types of housing where AVM may not be well suited? I'm just curious.
I'll state that in the task force effort to understand AVMs and unpackage it more, what we did determine is that in rural markets, it's not the best use of technology because of how properties and comparative sale values happen. But I will defer to my colleague to further provide clarity there.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Senator. Yeah, AVMs are extremely data dependent, and they need large volumes of data to work effectively, and you just don't have that in rural markets. AVMs also tend to work best in areas where the housing stock is homogeneous. AVMs make a lot of assumptions about the quality of construction, the condition, and so forth of the properties. So when you have urban areas or rural areas where the housing stock is varied, AVMs tend to break down and not be as reliable.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And let me add to the conversation, manufactured homes. We know that more than 20 million Americans live in manufactured homes. Many of them, our home buyers are Latinos, Native Americans, and the elderly. We want to improve the valuation for this important housing stock. Let me ask you, what is the plan for improving appraisals for the resale of manufactured home? Mr. Park, if you could touch on that.
The PAVE Task Force report doesn't specifically talk about manufactured homes, but the improvements.
And that's my concern. That's my concern. There's a whole market out there of manufactured homes that we should also be pulling into the housing market to put a roof over people's heads and give them opportunity to own a home. And it's not even included in this. So with your experience and background, could you touch on this a little bit? Valuing of manufactured homes, is it an important product that we should be considering here as we look at incorporating all housing types, particularly those for buyers who want to own a home?
Thank you, Senator. It's somewhat implicit that when you're talking about rural communities, you're also including manufactured homes and the issues associated with manufactured homes. Again, having enough appraisers in a community, having appraisers who are properly educated and know how to appraise manufactured homes. I have appraised quite a few manufactured homes myself, and they pose a very difficult appraisal problem a lot of times. And so you really have to know what you're doing. They may not be the most expensive properties in the neighborhood, but the difficulty in completing an appraisal assignment isn't really related to how expensive or what the value of the property is. It's more related to the specific issues within the appraisal assignment. And manufactured homes certainly are an important part of the rural market. And as we move forward, finding solutions to making sure that the manufactured home industry and consumers, more importantly, are part of that discussion.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. And count me in for the data transparency. I think it is so important. And I was listening to you earlier as you were talking and responding to some of my colleagues' questions. And I really appreciate your comments about appraisers needing awareness and training, removal of certain discretion to address what we see happening in communities where there's disparity. Let me ask you this, as somebody who works in the industry, how easy is it going to be to get somebody who's been working in this industry for a time, more sophisticated appraiser, to learn new skills or be willing to recognize the challenges that are faced now with some of the disparity that has come out in this report, and being willing to get this training or learn about the Fair Housing Act and Lending Act? Is there I guess, what incentives or what could we be doing at a federal level to help those appraisers get the training or the support that they need to learn and become aware?
Well, there is a challenge in training people who have been in the industry for 30 years and have been doing appraisals one particular way. I think that what we really need to, we need to focus on training for them, of course, but we also need to focus on bringing more appraisers, younger appraisers into the profession, and more diverse appraisers into the profession, particularly in these rural markets. We really have a lack of new expertise coming into the appraisal profession, and I think with having younger people coming in, we're going to have more people who appreciate these issues.
Thank you. I know my time is up. Thank you again for the panel discussion today.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Thank you to the witnesses. Senator Toomey will do a short close, and I will do a short close. And thanks so much for this hearing today. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I also want to thank the witnesses. Listen, we have heard and we know that there are terrible anecdotes of racial bias in appraisals. The question that we have to determine is whether this is a systemic problem that requires significant reforms. In my opinion, the conclusions that the PAVE task force has come to is not supported by data that they have shown us. It's not to say the data does not exist, but I don't see it in their reports. And the reports, that their conclusion relies very heavily on two studies. The studies themselves have serious shortcomings. First of all, they're preliminary. Secondly, in important respects, they disagree with each other in terms of conclusions. They use proprietary data, which is not available to the public, cannot be scrutinized. The reports themselves acknowledge that confounding factors other than racial bias could explain disparities that appear in the data. So for these and other reasons, I think we should proceed cautiously before we decide to upend an industry in a way that will result in higher costs for homeowners. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. I appreciate the ranking member's call for more study of appraisals. I agree. The PAVE task force agreed. Thank you for that. We benefit always from more data. I look forward to working with the administration and the ranking member and Senator Tester, who also chimed in, and any colleagues who want to help improve. Senator Smith mentioned that want to help improve the data we have. But we see problems, as the two witnesses pointed out so well in the process today. We need to tackle those problems. I want to thank the members of the task force for the work that you all did on this report. We know it cited a lot more than just two studies, and that they consulted countless members of the lending and appraisal industry, regulators, civil rights, consumers groups. I want to applaud the appraisal industry for the steps it's already taken. It's already identified to grow and diversify its workforce. We need to do much, much more to grow the number of appraisers around the country, rural areas especially, but other areas too, and to make sure the appraiser profession is open to everyone, as Ms. Taylor said a number of times, that it looks like the communities whom it serves. Thank you for being here. For senators who wish to submit questions, they're due 1 week from today, Tuesday, March 31st. To Mr. Park and Ms. Taylor, you have 45 days to respond to any of those questions. Thank you again. With that, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you. Thanks. We're going to do breakfast.